Mississippi Mill, 1873. In the suffocating heat of Mississippi in 1873, a young enslaved woman was purchased to care for the master's daughter. It wasn't a random choice. The master wanted a woman who was docile, quiet, and good with children. But what he didn't imagine was that this woman carried in her eyes the weight of generations and the strength of someone who learned to survive in silence. Her name was Claraara, and within 3 weeks of arriving at Thornton Estate, she would become the center of a storm that would shake the foundations of everything the master believed about power. Clara was 22 years old, born on a plantation in Louisiana, sold 3 times before she arrived at the Thornton Estate in Carroll County, Mississippi, purchased specifically to be a nursemaid for little Margaret Thornton, the master's only child, a 5-year-old girl with blonde curls and her father's cold blue eyes. But there was something about Claraara that the slave trader hadn't mentioned, something that would prove crucial in the weeks to come. Claraara could read. Her previous mistress in Louisiana had taught her secretly against all laws and customs, and Clara had used that skill to learn things, to understand the world beyond the plantation, to read newspapers and legal documents, to know her rights, even when those rights were denied. The Thornton Estate was a cotton plantation, 1,500 acres worked by 43 enslaved people. The big house sat on a small hill overlooking the fields, white columns and wide porches, magnolia trees providing shade, everything designed to project wealth and gentility. But the reality beneath that genteel surface was brutal. Charles Thornton ran his plantation with an iron fist, maximizing profit through violence and fear. His wife Abigail maintained the appearance of civilization, hosting dinner parties and charitable events while pretending not to see the cruelty that funded her comfortable life. Before we continue with this incredible story, comment which state you're listening from and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Let's continue. Charles Thornton was 38 years old, tall and handsome in a way that made people overlook his cruelty. He'd inherited the plantation from his father 10 years earlier. The old man had died suddenly, some said from apoplexy. Others whispered it was poison administered by an enslaved cook who'd finally had enough. Charles had taken over immediately, had proven himself even more ruthless than his father. He'd increased cotton production by 20% through methods that left people broken and dying in the fields. He was considered successful by his peers, a man of ambition and drive, someone to emulate. Abigail Thornton was 34, the daughter of a prominent Charleston family. She married Charles when she was 19, a strategic alliance between 2 wealthy families. Her father had needed Charles's money. Charles had needed her family social connections. Love had never been part of the arrangement. 15 years of marriage had taught Abigail many things, had taught her that her husband was cruel and selfish, had taught her that she had no legal power, no recourse, no escape, had taught her that survival meant compliance, meant looking away, meant accepting the unacceptable day after day until you couldn't remember who you'd been before. But Abigail had a secret, something she'd hidden even from herself for years, deep down beneath the layers of compromise and resignation. She was furious, had been furious for 15 years, and that fury was like a coal buried in ashes, cold on the surface but burning hot underneath, waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst, the right reason to burst into flame. Clara would become that catalyst, though neither of them knew it yet. Claraara was brought to the big house on a Monday morning in June. The heat was already oppressive, the air thick and still. She carried a small bundle containing everything she owned, 2 dresses, a shawl, a piece of ribbon her mother had given her before they were separated. She was taken to the nursery on the 2nd floor, a large sunny room with toys and books and a small bed where Margaret slept. Abigail Thornton was there, standing by the window. She turned when Clara entered, looked her up and down with the practiced assessment of someone used to evaluating property. "You're the new nursemaid," Abigail said. Her voice was cool, controlled. "Yes, ma'am," Claraara said quietly, keeping her eyes down as she'd been taught. "You'll care for Margaret, keep her clean and fed and entertained. You'll sleep here in the nursery, be available at all times. You'll take your meals in the kitchen with the other house staff. You'll speak only when spoken to. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara repeated. Abigail studied her for a moment longer. Something about this woman bothered her, something in her bearing. The way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her circumstances, it was unsettling, threatening somehow. Margaret was shy at first, hiding behind her mother's skirts, peeking out at Clara with curious eyes. But children are rarely shy for long, especially when they're lonely. Margaret had no siblings, no friends her own age. was isolated in this big house with only adults for company. By afternoon, she was showing Clara her dolls, telling her elaborate stories about tea parties and adventures, and Claraara listened patiently, responded with the right questions, made the child feel heard and important. By evening, Margaret was holding Claraara's hand, asking her to tell a story before bed. Clara told her about a little rabbit who was brave and kind and always helped others. It was a simple story, the kind any child would enjoy. But woven into it were subtle lessons about courage and resistance, about standing up to bullies, about protecting the weak. Clara had learned long ago that you could teach dangerous ideas if you wrap them in innocent stories. Margaret fell asleep smiling, and Claraara sat in the rocking chair beside her bed, grateful for this small space of peace, but also watchful, alert, knowing that peace never lasted long in places like this. Charles Thornton noticed Claraara immediately. How could he not? She was beautiful in a quiet way, with smooth, dark skin and large, expressive eyes. She moved gracefully, despite the exhaustion that came from years of hard labor, and there was something about her demeanor, her calm dignity, that he found intriguing and challenging. He made excuses to come to the nursery, checking on his daughter, asking questions about her care, standing too close to Claraara, letting his hand brush against hers when he reached for something. Clara recognized what was happening, had seen it before on other plantations, knew exactly where this was leading. But what made it worse this time, what made it more dangerous, was that Charles wasn't just attracted to Claraara. He was obsessed with breaking her. He'd noticed that quiet dignity, that sense that she knew something he didn't, that she was judging him even as she obeyed him, and he couldn't stand it, couldn't tolerate the idea that this enslaved woman might think herself his equal in any way. He was determined not just to use her body, but to destroy her spirit, to make her understand completely and irrevocably that she was nothing, that he was everything, that her only purpose was to serve his desires. For the first 2 weeks, Claraara focused entirely on Margaret, building trust with the child, establishing routines, making herself indispensable. She woke early to dress Margaret, made sure she ate properly, took her outside to play in the garden, taught her songs and games, read to her from the children's books in the nursery. And here Claraara took a risk. When they were alone, she would point to words, teach Margaret the letters, help her sound out simple sentences. It was dangerous. Teaching a white child to read was one thing, but teaching her in a way that also reinforced Claraara's own literacy was quite another. If anyone found out that Claraara could read, she would be severely punished. But she took the risk because knowledge was power, the only power she had. Margaret adored her, would cry if anyone else tried to put her to bed, would ask for Miss Claraara constantly, and Abigail noticed this, noticed how her daughter had bonded with this woman in a way she never had with previous nursemaids, noticed how Claraara was patient and kind, but also firm, setting boundaries, teaching discipline without harshness. And something about this bothered Abigail, stirred up feelings she'd buried long ago. She remembered wanting to be that kind of mother, remembered planning to raise her daughter with love and attention. But Charles had other ideas, believed children should be raised by servants while parents maintained distance and authority, and Abigail had complied as she always did, had given up that dream like she'd given up so many others. Charles's visits to the nursery became more frequent. He would arrive after Margaret was asleep, would sit in the chair by the window, would talk to Clara in a low voice, asking about her life, where she came from, what she thought about various things. It was a game to him, a cat playing with a mouse. He enjoyed watching her discomfort, enjoyed the way she tried to answer minimally without being disrespectful, tried to maintain distance without openly refusing him. Claraara answered carefully, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," trying not to engage, trying not to give him any encouragement. But her resistance only seemed to intrigue him more. Then one evening, 2 weeks after Claraara arrived, something happened that changed the dynamic. Charles came to the nursery earlier than usual. Margaret was still awake playing with her dolls. He picked up one of the books from the shelf, a collection of fairy tales. Said to Margaret, "Let's see if your new nursemaid can read to you." Handed the book to Claraara. Clara felt her heart stop. This was the test, the trap. If she admitted she could read, she'd be punished. If she pretended she couldn't read, she'd miss an opportunity. She made a split-second decision, took the book, opened it to a random page, and began to read. Her voice was clear and steady. She read the story of Cinderella, about a girl who was treated as a servant, but who had inner worth that eventually was recognized. She read beautifully with expression and emotion. Margaret was entranced. Charles was shocked. "Where did you learn to read?" he demanded. "My previous mistress taught me, sir," Claraara said quietly. "She believed literacy would make me a better nursemaid." Charles stared at her, his face unreadable. Then he smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Well, well," he said. "You're full of surprises, aren't you? We'll have to see what other talents you're hiding." He left the nursery. Clara's hands were shaking. She just revealed something that made her valuable, but also more vulnerable. She just made herself more interesting to Charles, which was the last thing she wanted. That night, Charles told Abigail about Clara's literacy, told her with a mixture of surprise and something darker. "The new nursemaid can read," he said. "Can you imagine educated right here in our house?" Abigail was setting out her clothes for the next day. She paused. "That's unusual," she said carefully. "Where did she learn?" "Apparently, her previous owner taught her," Charles said. "Can you believe it? Teaching a slave to read, it's against the law. Illegal in Mississippi, illegal in Louisiana. But some people think they're above the law." Abigail nodded, said nothing, but something stirred in her mind. A literate enslaved woman was dangerous, was unpredictable, but also potentially useful, potentially an ally if approached correctly. She filed that information away. The next morning, Abigail went to the nursery, found Claraara dressing Margaret for the day, sent Margaret to play in the garden under the supervision of another servant, then turned to Claraara. "You can read," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mom," Claraara admitted. There was no point denying it now. "My husband is intrigued by this," Abigail said, "but you should know it puts you in danger." "I know, Mom," Claraara said quietly. "I've always known that knowledge is dangerous for people like me, but ignorance is more dangerous. Ignorance keeps us helpless." Abigail looked at her sharply. "That's a bold thing to say," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Claraara replied, meeting her eyes for the first time. "But it's true." Abigail felt something shift inside her. This woman wasn't what she appeared to be, wasn't docile or simple or resigned. She was intelligent and aware and carefully hiding her strength. Abigail recognized that strategy because she'd been using it herself for 15 years, hiding her own intelligence, her own anger, her own capacity for action behind a mask of feminine compliance. "Can you write as well?" Abigail asked. "Yes, Mom," Claraara said. "I can write and cipher. I can keep accounts if needed." Abigail nodded slowly. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "In the meantime, be careful around my husband. He's not a kind man." "I know, Mom," Claraara said. "I've known many men like him." Over the following days, Charles's obsession with Claraara grew. He couldn't stop thinking about her dignity, her literacy, her quiet defiance. He began planning how he would break her, began imagining the satisfaction of reducing her to helpless submission. He talked about her constantly to his friends. Other plantation owners who gathered for drinks and cards told them about this educated he purchased, told them he was going to have some fun with her. His friends laughed and encouraged him, told him to enjoy himself, reminded him that she was his property to do with as he pleased. But Charles didn't know that one of those friends, a man named Henry Caldwell, who owned the neighboring plantation, was deeply uncomfortable with the conversation. Henry was a complicated man. He owned slaves, benefited from the system, but he'd never been comfortable with the sexual exploitation that was so common. He'd seen his own father destroy countless women, had watched his mother pretend not to notice, had promised himself he'd be different. He mostly kept that promise, but he also didn't intervene when other men bragged about their conquests, didn't challenge the system, just tried not to be the worst participant in it, which wasn't much of a moral stance, but was something. Henry started paying attention to what was happening at Thornton Estate, started asking subtle questions, started watching for signs of trouble. He didn't know what he would do if he saw something terrible happening. Probably nothing, probably just look away like everyone else. But at least he was paying attention. At least he was bearing witness. And sometimes that mattered. Sometimes bearing witness was the first step toward action, though usually it wasn't. Usually it was just another form of complicity dressed up as concern. Clara noticed Henry Caldwell's attention, noticed the way he looked at her with something like sympathy when he visited Thornton Estate, noticed that he was different from Charles and his other friends. She filed that information away, didn't trust him because he was still a slave owner, still part of the system, but noted that he might be a weak link, someone who could potentially be exploited if the situation became desperate enough. Clara was always thinking strategically, always looking for advantages, always preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. Meanwhile, the other enslaved people at Thornton Estate were watching the situation develop. There was an old woman named Esther who worked in the kitchen. She'd been at Thornton Estate for 30 years, had survived Charles's father and now Charles himself, had seen generations of women used and discarded. She tried to warn Claraara, tried to prepare her child. She said one evening when they were alone in the kitchen, "That man got his eye on you. You know what that means?" "I know," Claraara said quietly. "I've been expecting it." Esther shook her head. "Expecting it don't make it easier, don't make it hurt less." "I know that too," Claraara said. Esther told Claraara stories, histories of the plantation, of the women who'd come before. There was Sally, who'd been beautiful and proud. The old master had taken her as a mistress, kept her for 5 years, had 3 children with her. Then when his wife found out, he sold Sally and all 3 children to a slave trader heading to New Orleans. Never saw them again. There was Ruth, who'd fought back when the old master tried to force her. She'd scratched his face badly, drawn blood. He'd had her, whipped nearly to death, then sold her to a cotton plantation in the Delta, where the work was so brutal most people didn't survive 5 years. And there was Marie, who tried to run away after the master violated her. She made it 20 miams before the dogs caught her. They brought her back and made an example of her, whipped her in front of everyone, then sold her husband away as punishment. Claraara listened to these stories and understood their message. There was no escape, no successful resistance, no way to avoid what was coming. But she also noticed something else in the stories, a pattern. These women had all acted alone, had tried individual resistance, individual escape, individual rebellion, and they'd all been destroyed because the system was too strong, the power imbalance too great. One person alone couldn't win against an entire structure designed to crush them. But what if you weren't alone? What if you found allies? What if you built a network? What if you were patient and strategic and waited for the right moment? Then maybe possibly resistance could succeed. Clara began building that network carefully, subtly. She talked to the other house servants, learned their stories, their grievances, their fears. She talked to Benjamin, Thomas, and Isaac, the 3 enslaved men who worked closest to the big house, learned that they were intelligent and angry, and looking for any opportunity to strike back at the master who'd made their lives hell. She talked to Esther, learned that the old woman knew more than she let on, knew the plantation's secrets, knew where bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively, and slowly, carefully, Clara began to weave these people together, began to create the possibility of collective action. But she needed one more piece. She needed someone from the master's side, someone with legal power, someone who could provide protection and legitimacy to whatever they did. And the only person who fit that description was Abigail. Clara watched Abigail carefully, studied her, looked for signs of discontent, of suppressed rage, of potential alliance, and she found them. Found them in the way Abigail's hands clenched when Charles was cruel. Found them in the way she looked at the enslaved women with something like sympathy before quickly looking away. Found them in the way she held her daughter just a little too tight, as if afraid Margaret would be corrupted by her father's influence. Clara made a decision, a risky decision. She decided to trust Abigail just enough to test her. One afternoon when they were alone in the nursery, Margaret napping peacefully, Claraara said quietly, "Mom, may I ask you a question?" Abigail looked up from her needlework. Surprised. "Of course," she said. Clara took a breath. "Do you ever wish things were different? Do you ever imagine a world where people couldn't own other people? Where women had power over their own lives? Where cruelty wasn't rewarded and protected by law?" It was a dangerous question. Could be interpreted as rebellion. Could result in severe punishment. But Clara needed to know, needed to understand if Abigail was a potential ally or just another enemy. Abigail stared at her, shocked by the directness of the question. Her first instinct was to report this impertinence, to have Clara whipped for suggesting such things. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the honest desperation in Claraara's eyes. Maybe it was her own suppressed feelings finally breaking through. Maybe it was simply that she was tired of pretending. "Yes," Abigail said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wish things were different every single day. I've wished it for 15 years. But wishing changes nothing." "Power changes things," Claraara said. "And power can be taken, can be seized, can be used for good instead of evil if people are brave enough and smart enough and patient enough." Abigail looked at her. Really? Looked at her for the first time. "Who are you?" she asked. "Really, who are you?" I'm someone who refuses to accept that this is all there is. Clara said, I'm someone who believes change is possible. I'm someone who's waiting for the right moment to act. Before Abigail could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Both women immediately composed themselves, returned to their proper roles, mistress and servant. Abigail picked up her needlework. Claraara checked on Margaret. When Charles entered the nursery, he saw nothing unusual, just his wife doing handwork while the nursemaid tended his daughter. But something had shifted. Something had been set in motion. An alliance had begun to form. Fragile and uncertain, but real, and that alliance would soon be tested in ways neither woman could have predicted. Charles's visits to the nursery became more frequent and more aggressive. He no longer bothered with pretense, would arrive late at night, would stand over Claraara's bed, would make it clear what he wanted. Clara resisted as much as she dared, tried to delay, tried to redirect, but she knew time was running out, knew that eventually Charles would tire of the game and simply take what he wanted. She also knew that when that happened, when he finally violated her, that would be the moment. That would be the catalyst that turned potential resistance into actual action. Meanwhile, Charles was facing his own problems. The plantation wasn't as profitable as it had been. Cotton prices were dropping. Several of his investments had failed. He owed money to banks in Jackson and Vicksburg, was struggling to maintain the appearance of wealth while actually sliding toward bankruptcy. And this financial pressure made him more volatile, more cruel, more desperate to assert his power in the one area where he still felt in control, his absolute dominion over the enslaved people who worked his land. He began taking out his frustrations on the workers, increased their hours, reduced their rations, used his whip more freely. 3 people died that summer from overwork and malnutrition. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the property. Charles felt nothing, saw them as equipment that had worn out, easily replaced. But the other enslaved people felt everything, felt rage and grief and terror and desperate hope that someone somehow would make him pay for what he'd done. Clara listened to their anger, shaped it, directed it, prepared them for the moment when they could act. Abigail also noticed the increased brutality, noticed Charles's mood getting darker, noticed the fear in the house servant's eyes. She said nothing because she'd learned long ago that objecting only made things worse, made Charles more determined to prove his power. But she watched and she remembered and she made her own plans. She began reviewing her father's legal papers, papers she'd inherited but never paid much attention to. Began understanding what power she might have if she chose to use. It began calculating how she might gain control of the plantation if Charles was removed from the picture. Then one night in late June, 3 weeks after Claraara had arrived, everything came to her head. It was after midnight. The house was quiet except for the usual night sounds, crickets and frogs, the creak of old wood settling. Clara was dozing in the rocking chair beside Margaret's bed, exhausted from a long day. She woke to find Charles standing over her, smelling of whiskey and cigars, his hand on her shoulder. "Wake up," he said quietly, not bothering to hide his intentions anymore. "It's time you learned your place." Claraara stood immediately, stepped back. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "Please, sir," she said, "please don't do this. Miss Margaret might wake up." Charles smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "She won't wake up," he said. "I gave her medicine in her milk at dinner, made sure she'd sleep deep. Nobody's going to interrupt us, Claraara. Nobody's going to save you. You belong to me, and it's time you understood what that means." He moved toward her. Claraara backed away until she hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go. "Please," she said louder now. "Please don't." What Charles didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he was so confident in his absolute power, was that Abigail wasn't asleep. She'd heard him leave their bedroom, had heard his footsteps going toward the nursery, had known immediately what was happening. She lay in bed for a moment, wrestling with herself, thinking, "This is it. This is the moment. Either I act now, or I accept that I'm complicit, that I'm as guilty as he is, that I'm part of this evil." And she made her choice. She got up, put on her robe, and walked quietly down the hallway toward the nursery. She stood outside the door, her hand on the doorknob, listening, hearing Charles's voice low and threatening, hearing Clara's voice pleading, afraid, hearing the sounds of struggle. And Abigail felt something inside her break and reform, felt 15 years of suppressed rage finally break free, felt clarity for the first time in years. She knew exactly what she was going to do, knew the risks, knew the consequences, knew she was crossing a line she could never uncross, and she didn't care. She opened the door, stepped inside. Her voice was cold and clear. "Get away from her, Charles," she said. "Get away from her right now." Charles spun around, shocked. "Abigail, what are you?" I said. "Get away from her." Abigail repeated. Her voice was steady, controlled, but there was steel underneath. "This ends now." Charles stared at her, then laughed. "This is none of your concern," he said. "Go back to bed." "This is very much my concern," Abigail said. "She's part of my household, responsible for my daughter, and you're not going to touch her." Charles' expression darkened. "You don't give me orders," he said. "I'll do what I want with my property." "She's not property," Abigail said. "She's a human being, and you're not going to violate her. Not in my house, not under my roof, not while I'm alive to stop you." Charles moved toward Abigail, raised his hand to strike her. It wouldn't be the first time. Abigail flinched, but held her ground. Clara watched this unfold, watched this white woman standing up to this powerful white man, defending her, protecting her, risking everything. And Claraara made a decision. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the table beside the bed, stepped forward, and brought it down hard on the back of Charles's head. Not hard enough to kill him, but hard enough to stun him. Charles stumbled, fell to his knees, touched the back of his head. His hand came away bloody. He looked at Claraara with shock and rage. "You're dead," he said. "You're both dead. I'll have you hanged for this." But Abigail was already moving, already implementing a plan she'd been forming for weeks without quite realizing it. She ran to the hallway, called out, "Benjamin, Thomas, Isaac, come quickly. Bring rope." The three men arrived within minutes. They'd been sleeping in the quarters, but they'd learned to respond immediately when called. They saw Charles on his knees, saw blood on his head, saw Abigail standing there calm and determined, saw Claraara holding the candlestick, and they understood immediately that something extraordinary was happening, that the natural order was being disrupted, that an opportunity was presenting itself. "Tie him up," Abigail said. Her voice was steady, commanding. "Tie his hands and feet. We're taking him to the barn." The men hesitated for only a moment. This was dangerous. This could get them all killed. But they'd been waiting for a chance to strike back at Charles, waiting for years. And this was it. This was their moment. They grabbed Charles, tied his hands behind his back with rough rope. Charles was screaming now, threatening them, promising horrific punishment, but his words had no power. He was the one being restrained. He was the one helpless. And that realization terrified him more than anything else in his life. They dragged him down the stairs, out of the house, across the yard toward the old barn at the edge of the property. It was dark. The moon was barely a sliver. The only light came from the lantern Benjamin carried. Abigail walked ahead of them. Clara walked beside her. Neither woman spoke, but something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition that they'd crossed a line together, that whatever happened next, they would face it together, that they were allies now in a way that transcended race and class and all the artificial divisions that their society had constructed. The barn was old, hadn't been used in years. The roof was partially collapsed. The walls were weathered and rotting. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by oak trees, isolated and hidden from view. They brought Charles inside. The interior was dim and dusty even with the lantern, old tools hanging on the walls, hay scattered on the dirt floor. There was a thick wooden beam running across the center of the barn. Dutch, the overseer, had arrived by then, drawn by the commotion. When he saw what was happening, he immediately understood that he had a choice to make. Side with Charles, who was currently tied up and bleeding, or side with Abigail, who was clearly in control. It was an easy decision. Dutch had always been loyal to whoever paid him, and right now, Abigail was the one with power. "Throw a rope over that beam," Abigail ordered. Dutch complied. They tied Charles's hands behind his back, then pulled the rope through his bound hands and over the beam, hauled him up until his arms were stretched above his head and his feet barely touched the ground. It was a position of complete helplessness, complete vulnerability. Charles was still screaming, still threatening, but his voice was getting weaker, hoarser. He was beginning to understand that this time his threats meant nothing, that he was truly powerless for the first time in his life. Abigail stood in front of him, studied him like he was an insect pinned to a board. 15 years, she said quietly. 15 years. I've watched you hurt people, watched you destroy lives, watched you use your power to take whatever you wanted without regard for anyone else. 15 years, I've been complicit. I've looked away. I've pretended not to see. I've maintained the fiction of our perfect marriage while dying inside. But not anymore. Charles, not anymore. Charles, not anymore. She turned to Claraara. Tell him what he did to you, she said. Tell him so everyone hears. So there's no doubt, so there's no way for him to pretend it didn't happen. Claraara stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but clear. You came to the nursery tonight, she said. You told me I belonged to you. You tried to force yourself on me. You've been planning this for weeks. Everyone knew what you intended. Everyone saw it coming. And you thought there would be no consequences. You thought your power was absolute, but you were wrong. Abigail nodded, cut his shirt off. She said to Dutch, let him feel what it's like to be exposed, to be vulnerable, to be helpless. Dutch picked up a knife from the wall, cut Charles's shirt away, let it fall to the dirt floor. Charles was bare-chested now, his skin pale in the lantern light. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing, less powerful. Abigail walked around him slowly. You like having power over others, she said. You like making people afraid, making them submit, making them feel helpless. So now you're going to know what that feels like. You're going to experience the fear and helplessness you've inflicted on so many others. She picked up a short leather strap from the wall. It was used for disciplining horses, was designed to cause pain without permanent damage. She held it in her hand, tested its weight, looked at Charles. This is for Sally, she said, and brought the strap down across his back. Not hard enough to cause serious injury, but hard enough to hurt, hard enough to sting and burn. Charles cried out more from shock than pain. He'd never been struck before in his life, had always been the one inflicting pain, never receiving it. This is for Ruth, Abigail said, and struck again. This is for Marie, another strike. This is for all the women you've violated over the years, for all the families you've torn apart, for all the children you've sold away from their mothers, for all the people you've worked to death, for all the cruelty you've inflicted without consequence. She kept striking, not wildly, not out of control, but methodically, deliberately, each blow calculated to hurt without causing permanent damage. After 10 strikes, Abigail stopped, handed the strap to Claraara. Your turn, she said. Claraara took the strap, looked at Charles hanging there crying, felt all the rage and fear and pain she'd been carrying for years, for her entire life, felt the accumulated suffering of generations, and she struck once, twice, 3 times, each blow carrying the weight of every violation, every humiliation, every moment of helplessness. Charles was sobbing now, all his arrogance gone, all his power stripped away, leaving just a pathetic man who'd finally faced consequences for his actions. Abigail raised her hand, stopping the beating. That's enough, she said. We're not trying to kill him. We're trying to teach him. She turned to Benjamin, Thomas, and Isaac. Take him down. Put him in the root cellar. Chain him there. No food for 3 days, just enough water to keep him alive. I want him to have time to think, time to understand what he's done, time to realize that his power was always an illusion. The men untied Charles, dragged him out of the barn toward the root cellar. He was too broken to resist, too shocked to fight back, just let himself be dragged, like a sack of grain. The root cellar was beneath the old kitchen building, a damp, dark space used for storing vegetables. It was maybe 8 feet square with a dirt floor and stone walls. They threw Charles inside, chained his ankle to a support post. The chain was long enough that he could move around a little but not reach the door. Dutch told him he'd check once a day, told him if he made noise, if he tried to call for help, they'd gag him, leave him in complete silence. Charles nodded numbly. All the fight had gone out of him. They left him there alone in the darkness. Abigail and Claraara walked back to the house together. Dawn was breaking. The sky was lightening in the east. Birds were starting to sing. It should have felt like a new beginning, like liberation. But instead, both women felt the weight of what they'd done, felt the danger they were now in. What happens now? Claraara asked quietly. Now we prepare, Abigail said. Charles has friends, allies, people who will come looking for him. We need to be ready. We need a plan that goes beyond just punishing him. We need a way to actually change the situation permanently. Otherwise, this was just temporary revenge. Just a moment of satisfaction before everything collapses. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Abigail reviewed legal documents, consulted with her father's lawyers in Jackson, found ways to potentially gain control of the plantation if Charles was declared incompetent. Clara talked to the other enslaved people, built support, made sure everyone understood what was happening and what was at stake. Dutch, the overseer, proved surprisingly useful. He knew Charles's business dealings, knew about the debts, knew which creditors were pressing hardest, knew that the plantation was on shaky financial ground. This information became leverage, became a tool they could use. On the third day, Abigail went to the root cellar, opened the door, looked inside. Charles was huddled in the corner, filthy and broken, 3 days in darkness. With minimal food and water had done something to him, had stripped away the last vestiges of his arrogance and pride. When he saw Abigail, he started crying, started begging to be let out, promising he would change, promising anything. Abigail stood there looking down at him with no pity, no compassion, just cold calculation. "I'm going to make you an offer," she said. "You're going to sign papers giving me legal control of this plantation. You're going to claim mental incompetence, going to say you're unable to manage the estate, going to appoint me as conservator with full authority." "I can't," Charles said weakly. "The law, a married woman can't." "There are ways," Abigail interrupted. "My father's lawyers have found precedents, unusual circumstances where wives have gained control. It requires your voluntary signature and witness testimony about your incapacity. We have both. The overseer and several white employees will testify that you've been acting erratically, making poor decisions, endangering the plantation. With their testimony and your signature, the court will approve the arrangement." Charles shook his head. "I won't sign. I'll never sign. I'll never sign." Abigail smiled coldly. "Then you'll stay here," she said. "Stay in the cellar until you die. And I'll tell everyone you abandoned the plantation, ran away from your debts, disappeared in the night. Your friends will believe it because they know about your financial problems. They'll assume you fled to avoid your creditors, and I'll take control anyway through abandonment laws." Charles understood he had no choice. Understood that Abigail had thought this through, had prepared for every contingency, had become someone he didn't recognize, someone capable and ruthless. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll sign whatever you want, just let me out of here." Abigail nodded. They brought him to the house, cleaned him up, had the documents ready. Charles signed everything with shaking hands. Abigail witnessed. The signatures had Dutch and 2 other white employees of the plantation witness as well, making it legally binding. Then she gave Charles money, $500, enough to start over somewhere else. Had Dutch drive into the train station in Greenwood, put him on a train heading north, watched until the train disappeared. When Abigail returned to Thornton Estate, she was its legal owner, had full authority to run it as she saw fit. The transformation began immediately. She reduced the brutality, improved living conditions for the enslaved workers. She couldn't free them. The law wouldn't allow it. Mississippi in 1873 was still deeply committed to white supremacy even after the war. But she could make their lives more bearable. She paid small wages, allowed families to stay together, reduced working hours slightly, stopped the most extreme punishments. It wasn't freedom, wasn't justice, wasn't enough, but it was better, and people noticed. Claraara's position changed dramatically. She was still technically enslaved, still legally property, but Abigail gave her real authority over the household, paid her wages that Claraara could save, treated her with respect, allowed her to make decisions. Their relationship evolved, became something neither of them had a name for. Not quite friendship because of the power imbalance, not quite partnership because of the legal inequality, but something real built on shared experience and mutual respect, and the memory of that night when they crossed every line together. Margaret continued to adore Clara, didn't understand exactly what had happened, knew only that her father was gone and her mother was different now. Stronger, more present, more engaged. Clara continued teaching Margaret both the basic skills she was supposed to teach and the more dangerous lessons about equality and justice and human dignity. Margaret absorbed these lessons, would carry them forward, would become a different kind of light Southern woman because of Claraara's influence. But the story wasn't over. Charles's disappearance and Abigail's sudden control of the plantation raised questions. Neighbors came calling, asked what had happened, where Charles had gone. Abigail told them the same story every time. Her husband had suffered a mental breakdown, had been unable to cope with the financial pressures, had signed over control and left to seek treatment in the North. Most people accepted this explanation, had seen Charles's erratic behavior, knew about his debts, but some were suspicious, particularly other plantation owners who saw Abigail's reforms as threatening, as setting a dangerous precedent. One of these suspicious neighbors was a man named Marcus Webb. He owned a plantation 10 miles south of Thornton Estate, was one of Charles's closest friends, had been present for many of the conversations where Charles had bragged about his plans for Claraara. Marcus didn't believe Abigail's story, thought something more had happened, thought maybe Charles had been forced out, maybe even killed. He started asking questions, investigating, talking to people, trying to piece together what had really happened that night. Marcus came to Thornton Estate one afternoon, asked to speak with Abigail. They sat in the parlor, tea served by house servants who kept their faces carefully neutral. Marcus was direct. Charles wouldn't have just left, he said, wouldn't have given up his plantation without a fight. Something happened here. Something you're not telling us. Abigail met his eyes calmly. My husband had a breakdown, she said, signed the papers of his own free will, left voluntarily. If you don't believe me, you're welcome to hire lawyers, review the documents, interview the witnesses. Everything was done legally and properly. Marcus studied her, trying to read her, trying to find a crack in her story. What about the slave girl? He said, the one Charles was interested in, the one who can read. Is she still here? Claraara is my daughter's nursemaid. Abigail said, she's part of my household. Why do you ask? Just curious. Marcus said, Charles talked about her a lot, seemed quite taken with her. I want to make sure she's being treated properly. Claraara is treated well, Abigail said firmly. She's valuable to me. Essential too. My daughter's care. I have no intention of selling her or allowing anyone to harm her. Marcus left unsatisfied, unconvinced. He continued investigating, hired a private detective, a man who specialized in finding fugitive slaves and investigating plantation disputes. The detective started interviewing people, enslaved and free, asking questions, offering money for information. He talked to other plantation owners, to merchants in town, to anyone who might know something about what had happened at Thornton Estate, and slowly, piece by piece, he began assembling a picture that contradicted Abigail's official story. The detective talked to a fieldsman from a neighboring plantation who claimed he'd seen activity at Thornton Estate late one night in June, had seen lanterns moving toward the old barn, had heard sounds that might have been shouting. The detective talked to a merchant in Carrollton who said Charles had seemed desperate the last time they'd spoken, had asked about selling equipment quickly, had seemed afraid of something. The detective talked to the train station master in Greenwood, who remembered a man matching Charles's description boarding a train north, remembered he'd seen broken, defeated, accompanied by Thornton Estate's overseer, who'd watched him board like a prisoner. The detective compiled all this information, presented it to Marcus Webb, told him that while he couldn't prove anything illegal had happened, the evidence suggested Charles had been coerced, had been forced to sign the papers under duress, had been essentially kidnapped and expelled from his own plantation. Marcus took this information to other plantation owners, showed them the detective's report, argued that Abigail needed to be stopped, that what she'd done set a dangerous precedent, that if wives could seize control from their husbands, if enslaved people could participate in such actions without consequence, the entire system was threatened. A group of plantation owners led by Marcus Webb decided to take action. They couldn't bring legal charges because the documents were properly executed, but they could apply social and economic pressure. They could make Abigail's life difficult, could refuse to do business with her, could ostracize her socially, could make it clear that what she'd done was unacceptable. They held a meeting, agreed on a strategy, decided to confront Abigail together, force her to either admit what had really happened or face complete isolation. When Abigail learned about this group, about their investigation and their plans, she knew she had to act decisively, had to find a way to neutralize the threat they represented. She couldn't fight them directly, didn't have enough power or influence, but she could outmaneuver them, could use information as a weapon, could expose their own vulnerabilities and hypocrisies. She called a meeting with Clara, Dutch, Benjamin, Thomas, and Isaac, told them about the situation, asked for ideas. Together, they developed a plan. The plan was risky, depended on several things going right, depended on people making the choices Abigail predicted they would make. But it was possible, and it was their best option. Abigail sent letters to each of the plantation owners in Marcus Webb's group, invited them to Thornton Estate for dinner, told them she wanted to address their concerns, wanted to clear the air, wanted to prove that everything had been done properly and legally. The men accepted the invitation, saw it as an opportunity to confront Abigail on her own territory, to force her to admit the truth. On the night of the dinner, 8 plantation owners arrived at Thornton Estate, including Marcus Webb. They were shown into the dining room, a long table set with fine china and crystal, candles providing soft light. Abigail greeted them graciously, played the perfect hostess, served them an excellent meal, waited until they were comfortable, had drunk enough wine to be relaxed before she revealed her real purpose. "Gentlemen," she said finally, "I know you have concerns about how I came to control this plantation, about what happened to my husband, and I'm prepared to tell you the truth. The whole truth. But first, I want to show you something." She nodded to Dutch, who brought in a leather portfolio. Abigail opened it, spread documents across the table. "These are records," she said. "Ledgers, correspondence, contracts. They document various illegal activities conducted by plantation owners in this county, including several of you here tonight." She pointed to specific documents. "This one shows that Marcus Webb has been claiming more enslaved people on his census than he actually owns, collecting government subsidies for people who don't exist. That's fraud, federal crime." She pointed to another document. "This one shows that Thomas Ricks has been smuggling enslaved people from Alabama without proper documentation, avoiding taxes and import fees, also illegal." The men stared at the documents, tried to understand where Abigail had gotten this information, how she knew these things. "My husband kept detailed records." Abigail explained. "He was involved in many of these schemes, participated in the fraud and smuggling and other crimes, and he documented everything, kept copies of everything. Insurance, in case anyone ever turned against him. When I took control of the plantation, I found all his records, studied them carefully, and I've made copies, sent them to lawyers in Jackson with instructions to deliver them to federal authorities. If anything happens to me or to anyone under my protection." The room was completely silent. The men understood immediately what Abigail had done. She'd created mutually assured destruction. If they moved against her, she would destroy them, expose their crimes, bring down legal consequences that would ruin them all. It was brilliant and ruthless and exactly the kind of leverage she needed. "Gentlemen," Abigail said calmly, "I have no interest in exposing anyone, no desire to cause trouble. I simply want to run my plantation in peace, want to be left alone, to manage my affairs as I see fit. If you're willing to do that, willing to stop investigating and stop pressuring me, then these documents will remain private. But if you continue to interfere, if you try to undermine me or harm anyone under my protection, then everything goes public. The choice is yours." Marcus Webb stood up. His face was red with rage and humiliation. "This is blackmail," he said. "This is," Abigail interrupted, "exactly what my husband would have done. I learned from the best. The only difference is I'm using these tools to protect people rather than exploit them. Now sit down and make your decision." Marcus sat, looked around at the other men, saw fear and calculation in their eyes. They were all thinking the same thing, weighing the risk of exposure against the satisfaction of punishing Abigail, and the math was clear. Exposure would destroy them, would cost them everything, while leaving Abigail alone cost them nothing except pride. The decision was obvious. "We'll leave you alone," Marcus said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "We'll stop investigating, stop interfering. But know this, Abigail, you've made enemies tonight, powerful enemies. If you ever slip, if you ever make a mistake, we'll be there." "Excellent," Abigail said pleasantly. "I wouldn't expect anything less. Now, gentlemen, dessert is served." The rest of the evening was tense, but civil. The men ate their dessert, made polite conversation, left as soon as they reasonably could, and Abigail watched them go, knowing she'd won this round, but also knowing the war wasn't over, would never be over as long as she lived in this world, in this system. Clara had watched the entire dinner from behind a curtain, had seen Abigail outmaneuver these powerful men, had seen her use their own corruption against them, had seen her secure safety for herself and for Claraara and for everyone else at Thornton Estate, and Claraara felt something she'd never felt before, something like hope. Something like the possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could change, that individual acts of courage and intelligence could create spaces of relative justice even within unjust systems. The years that followed were not easy. Abigail faced constant challenges, financial pressures, social isolation, threats from people who hated what she represented, but she persisted, kept the plantation running, kept treating the enslaved people with as much humanity as the system allowed. When the Civil War came in 1861, when Mississippi seceded and joined the Confederacy, Abigail quietly supported the Union, provided information to federal agents, helped enslaved people escape north, took risks that could have gotten her killed. When the war ended and slavery was abolished, Abigail was one of the few plantation owners who adapted smoothly, offered wage labor contracts, maintained relationships with the formerly enslaved people. Clara stayed not because she had to, but because she chose to. Because this place had become home in a strange way, because her relationship with Abigail, while still complicated and marked by history, was also real, was built on mutual respect and shared struggle. Claraara lived to see freedom, lived to see her children and grandchildren grow up free, lived to tell her story and make sure it was remembered. Abigail lived into old age, died in 1921 at 822. In her final years, she wrote a detailed memoir, told the truth about what had happened in 1873, about the night she'd heard everything and chosen revenge, about how she and Clara had stopped Charles, about how they built an unlikely alliance that had protected people and created change, however limited. Her memoir was controversial. Some condemned her, others celebrated her, but everyone agreed she'd been extraordinary, had done something remarkable. The story of that night, of what Claraara and Abigail did together, became legend in the community, was told and retold, was used to teach about resistance and courage and the complicated nature of justice. It became a reminder that even in the worst systems, even in the most oppressive circumstances, people could choose to act, could choose humanity over cruelty, could choose to protect the vulnerable, even at great personal risk. And those choices mattered, created ripples that spread far beyond. Any individual life contributed to larger movements for justice and equality. The master tried to use the slave nanny, thought his power was absolute, thought he could take whatever he wanted without consequence. But his wife heard everything, chose revenge over complicity, chose Claraara over her husband, chose justice over comfort, and that choice changed everything. Saved Claraara, transformed Abigail, created a space of relative humanity within an inhuman system, and proved that resistance was possible, that courage could emerge from unexpected places, that the powerless were never completely powerless as long as they could think and plan and act together. The story teaches that individual courage matters, that allies can emerge from unexpected places, that systems of oppression contain their own contradictions and vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and that we all face choices every day about complicity and resistance, about looking away or bearing witness, about accepting injustice or fighting against it however we can. And those choices define us, shape our world, create our legacy, one act of courage at a time.